Now it's time for today's perspective on the programme. And imagine you're a successful graduate just out of Harvard University in the US. You're thinking perhaps of law for your future career, but you're not quite sure it's really your thing. So you decide to do something a little bit different first, something that will dramatically change your life. Well, that's what happened to my guest today, Michelle Kuo, who opted to travel to the Mississippi Delta to try to make a difference there, to try to encourage the students to pick up books and read. Well, Michelle did just that, and it took her to a whole new place with some incredible stories and people along the way. So she put them in her book, Reading with Patrick, it's called. And Michelle joins me here in the studio to talk about it. Let's start at the beginning. Why did you first of all go to the Mississippi Delta, a town called Helena, wasn't it? And what did you find when you got there?
I went to the Mississippi Delta because I had studied the civil rights movement in college. And I realized that we have this whole heroic, iconic story of the civil rights movement in the Delta. Martin Luther King marched in the Delta. The term Black Power was coined there. But 50 years later, the Delta is still poor. It's still segregated. It's still dramatically in need of change. And I wanted to be a part of what I thought was a way to connect to that history, to continue what those heroes had started.
I mean, you talk in the book, don't you, about just how difficult it is for the students there who are trying to learn.
Yeah, so when I went there, what really struck me was the immense poverty. In Phillips County, Arkansas, where I was, it's one of the 20 poorest counties in America. It's extremely rural. In the town where I lived, there was no bookstore, no movie theater, no places where kids could be kids as well. And the students I had were in the 9th grade, but reading at a 4th grade reading level.
And the book is called Reading with Patrick, and that's because the student who's featured most prominently in the book is Patrick. Tell us about Patrick.
He was the kind of kid who broke up other fights. He kept to himself. He's the kind of kid you could forget about because you're so hectic and trying to handle the classroom, but he was incredibly capacious. If you handed him a book, he would read it, and he had such a curiosity that I think every teacher wants to tap into. He had one chronic problem, which was his absences. Sometimes he just wouldn't show up to school, and he was in the 8th grade and 15 years old at the time. And one thing I did, I mean, education is incredibly complex, but one thing that was remarkably easy was just getting him to come to school. I was 22 and crazy, so I'd just show up to his house, knock on his door, and be like, hey, you need to come to school tomorrow. And he did. I think he needed more adults in his life to guide him because his mother was working 2 full-time jobs and night shifts.
But having the passion to do that is quite impressive.
I mean, I think young people have a lot of energy, so I didn't think it was anything different than what other teachers my age were doing.
That kind of sums up the first part of the book, doesn't it, with you trying to do your best for the students. But then it's announced that the school's going to close, and you do decide to go off to law school, don't you, initially anyway, leaving the Delta behind. I know that was a real wrench for you, wasn't it?
Yeah, you have this certain idea of yourself as a good person, and it collapses at various points in your life. And that was one moment where I felt like I was taking the easy way out, where I was choosing something more comfortable, something more familiar. The longer you stay in a place like the Delta and in any poor rural area, you realize that people with means leave, people without means stay behind. And I didn't want to be a person who left. And then that's exactly what I did. I left. I went to law school.
Then something draws you back, doesn't it? You get some bad news about Patrick.
Yeah, a friend of mine who has stayed calls and tells me, he says, you had Patrick as a student, right? And my first instinct was that he had died because there's such a high mortality rate of teenagers. But then my friend goes on to say that Patrick got into a fight and killed someone. I was shocked. I thought it had to be a mistake, that this was a different Patrick that he was talking about. But even as I wrote the book later on, I understood that this kind of shock was a sign of my own middle-class upbringing. It doesn't, whether you get caught up in a violent situation has little to do with whether you're by nature an aggressive person or a peaceful person, or whether you're, as Patrick was, the kind of guy who broke up fights and who hated seeing people fight. When you grow up in a disadvantaged neighborhood, you live with a different set of experiences. In Patrick's case, like a lot of kids his age, you experience a lot of trauma from a young age from witnessing violence. You overact in situations. You also seek to defend your own because the police is incompetent and you can't rely on them.
At the end, though, I mean, you decide, don't you, to go back and you help Patrick an awful lot more, particularly with all his reading, and you visit him regularly in prison, don't you, and help him along the road, if you like. Who do you blame for all this? I mean, whose fault is it that all these kids are subjected to what they're subjected to?
I mean, I really think it comes down to poverty and inequality. We're talking about schools that have police officers but no counselors, that send kids to jail when they get into a fight instead of really tackling problems of trauma. And we're talking about kids who come to school hungry. Half of the children in the Delta the term is food insecure. So we're talking about the failure to secure economic and social rights. In Patrick's case, all of those are applicable. And then even more, this book is about prison education and the transformative effect of literacy. The single greatest predictor for whether you go to prison is your education level. And Patrick, when he went to prison, had completed the 8th grade. If you think about the desire of a lot of incarcerated people to continue their education, I think surveys have it at 70%. You can think about what a waste it is that so many of our prisons don't offer any education programs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what you blame. Michelle, it's great to have you on the programme today. I thoroughly recommend the book, Reading with Patrick, as I say it's called, and well done to you as well for putting such a heroic effort in helping Patrick and the other people in the class as well. Thanks for
Thank you so much for having me.